Okay, we are on Revelation Part 3, Lesson 6, I think? Yes, Lesson 6. I have put some things up on the board as I did last week. I may continue to do some of that because our timeline is very important. And instead of taking the time to write these things up here, we'll use it as a review to get started. But these are things that are givens. One of the things I want to do today as we look at what's up there is I want all of us to tell where we found it. You don't have to say which verse necessarily, but just say, did we find it in Revelation, which is what we studied in Part 2, what we're studying now, but we've now started venturing outside the book of Revelation. We looked last week several times in the book of Daniel. We also looked in the book of, was it 1st or 2nd Thessalonians?
2nd.
Thank you. Good answer. Sorry if somebody will let the dog out. You must do something. Yeah, we are in a home and it does end up being kind of chaotic at times. But so we were in Daniel last week. We were in Matthew last week. What chapter? Last week. What? Not this week of work, but the previous week.
Matthew?
We were in Matthew.
23?
23 and 24. Right. Then we added which chapter this week? 25. And we went to chapter 13, I think it was.
Oh, yeah, 13.
Yeah. But we also, so we're going to be reminded. That's what we're going to do by way of review. And if you don't remember, I'll try to remember. Okay, so what we have here on this timeline, obviously is not to scale. Okay, because you have the cross back here, which we know is about what time do we believe that the crucifixion happened?
23 or 24?
33 or 32 to 34-ish.
I knew that.
Yeah, I know you do. AD. So back here I've got 445 BC decree. What decree would that have been?
To rebuild the temple.
Very good. Well, to restore and rebuild.
Not the temple?
I'm trying to remember. I am not, I'm hesitating because I want to make sure I tell you the right thing.
Jerusalem?
It's either Jerusalem, it's in where? Where do we find that? Daniel chapter 9, verse 25. Jerusalem. Okay. There were different decrees, and one of them was to rebuild the temple. That's the reason I hesitate, because I want to make sure we got it right. But this one was to, what we were setting our time based on from Daniel chapter 9, verse 25, was the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. And that happened in 445 BC. We don't find that date in the Bible. We find that date outside the Bible in historical documents. Okay? But we do know there was a decree in 445 BC to rebuild Jerusalem. And that's when the clock starts ticking on the Daniel 9 prophecies. Okay? We're gonna look at a little bit of that. But it ends, and I've got 69 weeks here. Why do I have 69 weeks written here under the cross? Again,
69 weeks have already occurred.
Of where? Where do we find that? You're right, 69 weeks have occurred up to this point from whose prophecy?
Daniel.
That Daniel wrote down from God, right? But in Daniel 9 again. Okay, so in Daniel 9, and that's what I was referring to in verse 25 to start with, there's 70 weeks that have been given to Daniel's people. Weeks being 7 periods of time. So 77 periods of time, or 490 somethings, and we've determined that was years, based on the fact that from 445 to the cross was 69 of those weeks, because that's what Daniel 9 tells us. It said 62 and 7, which is 69 weeks, ended here. And it not at the cross, it actually ended on what we call Palm Sunday, the Sunday prior to the crucifixion, but right around the cross. So that's, and then I've got 70 AD there, which again was part of Daniel's prophecy that the city would be destroyed. And we know that happened historically in 70 AD. Okay, then I've got up here a three tick marks or whatever, starting with a covenant. There's going to be a covenant for how long?
3.5 years.
No. The covenant is for how long?
Oh, forever.
No,
No,
not the covenant of God. There is a covenant, a firm covenant that's going to be established with Daniel's people for 1 week, the last week of the 70. Okay? You've got 69 here. Now you have the 70th week, which is 7 years. Okay? It's that covenant. Now that prophecy is also found in Daniel chapter 9. that he will make a firm covenant, he being, referring back to the one who's coming from the people who crucified Christ. And we established the people who crucified Christ. What people crucified Christ?
The Jews.
Well, no.
The Romans.
The Romans
They
crucified
actually did it, but
Yes.
the Jews were behind. I mean, they.
Yes, the Jews gave him up and they wanted it. But yes, the nation that was in charge at the time
With
was
the
Rome.
Romans.
Okay, so the one that's going to establish this firm covenant with the many will come out of the people who crucified Christ, which is the Roman people. Okay, so then we have a midpoint of this 70th week, which is 7 years. And in the book of Revelation, I'm going to hand you that one. In the book of Revelation, there is a pivotal point. We got to remember this. There's a pivotal point from which all the things of Revelation time, all the time phrases, either come up to or go away from. And what is that point in Revelation? What?
Seventh trumpet.
Thank you very much. Seventh trumpet. Yes. At the end of the sixth, in the beginning of the seventh trumpet, there are many time phrases given to us. And they're found in chapter 10, they're found in chapter 11, they're found in chapter, others, 12 and 13 also. But the seventh trumpet occurs, we find the seventh trumpet occurring in chapter 11. Okay. We also found two personages in chapter 11. Remember, I always do this, 1 and 1. Gives us how many? 2. And who are those personages we found? The 2 witnesses. Okay, and the 2 witnesses have a prophesying ministry or prophesying time. They also do signs and wonders. They do a lot of things. How long is the period of time that they're going to prophesy? 3.5 years. Okay, and we know it ends at the 7th trumpet, when the 7th trumpet is about, or the end of the 6th trumpet as the 7th trumpet is about to sound. So we know from the 7th trumpet backwards is 3.5 years, right? And that covers from when the covenant starts to when the 7th trumpet sounds, that 3.5 years. Now we don't know how many of the 7 seals and the first 6 trumpets that 3.5 years covers. We don't know that for sure. Okay, at this point, we don't know that for sure. But we do know there's 3.5 years. We do know this covenant is for 7 of those 3.5, so the 7th trumpet would be in the middle. But we've established it for other reasons. From the 7th trumpet on, from the book of Revelation, we have some things, some time phrases. We have, in chapter 12, we have the war in heaven, where Satan is thrown down to the earth. We find that in chapter 12. And when he comes down to earth, he only has a short time, and he has lots of rage. And what does he do? What is the first thing he does? He goes after the woman that's also mentioned in chapter 12, and that woman is Israel. We established that. So the woman flees to the wilderness for how long?
3.5 years.
3.5 years. Now the time phrases don't say 3.5, well, say time, times, and half a time. But we're going to just start using 3.5 years because it's easier to remember. But it'll be 42 months. Time, times, and half a time are 1,260 days. Those are the time phrases we're given. Just like the 2 witnesses have a period of time that's 3.5 years. We also see the woman fleeing to the wilderness because Satan comes after her. Then if you turn the page and you go to chapter 13 of Revelation, who do you find in unlucky 13? What personage do you find in chapter 13 of Revelation? Big, bad,
The beast.
The beast, thank you. 2 beasts, I saw your 2 fingers, 2 beasts. The first beast has authority given to him by whom?
Satan.
Satan, right. Satan gives Satan's authority to the beast for how long?
3.5 years.
3.5 years, 42 months. He goes and he wars with the saints for those. He has blasphemous things come out of his mouth. There's a lot of things talked about the beast, but the time phrase is 3.5 years. Okay, now we know at the end of that 3.5 years, what happens to the beast?
He's
Thrown into the lake of fire. He's thrown into the lake of fire, and that's LOF. Lake of fire is not LOL, it's LOF. And the false prophet with him. The false prophet, we figure out by then, and one other place, is the second beast mentioned in chapter 13. Because he's the one that does the signs and wonders in the presence of the beast. Okay? So, the other thing we know is the reason the 2 witnesses end here at the 7th trumpet is what happens to them.
They're killed.
They're killed by
the beast.
the beast. Okay, so we know the beast is on the scene over here. He has to be at some point on the scene during that first 3.5 years because he kills them at the end of their ministry. Okay? And then we also know some other strange things about the beast from chapter 13 and also from chapter 17 when it's describing, I'll make sure if I've got the right, yeah, when it's describing the beast that the woman, the harlot is riding on. It tells us that this beast, which is the beast of chapter 13, has a fatal wound that's healed. He was not, and he is come again. And then he goes to destruction. So it's like these really strange phrases. But in chapter 12, we're told twice he's got a fatal wound that's healed, but we also are told the second time that it's by a sword. Okay? So with the beast that kills the 2 witnesses comes out of the abyss. It's the idea of having been dead and come back to life. Okay? So before this point, before the 7th trumpet point, before he kills the 2 witnesses, he has died and come back to life, and then he kills the 2 witnesses. And in chapter 13, it says who can basically do anything to the beast. I mean, you think about it. Nothing could happen to the 2 witnesses because fire would proceed out of their mouths and kill their enemies. But then the beast, who's dead and comes back to life, which is going to be a phenomenon the world is going to notice, is going to come and kill the 2 witnesses. Who can stop him is what everybody's going to think. Who can touch him? He touched the untouchables. But of course they come back to life and go to heaven in the presence of their enemies, but he still killed them. Okay? Now, so the beast is on the scene over here, but it's in this period of time that he's given the authority of Satan, he's given the kingdom of Satan, he's empowered by Satan, and he wars against the saints during that period of time. So what does that tell you is going to be going on during that time? Well, it's very obvious. Warring against the saints is going to be going on during that time. It's not going to be an easy time.
No.
It's going to be a really bad time. Okay? So the beast is going to war against the saints. And he's going to overcome some of them. Okay? Not overall, not in the overall scheme of God's plan. But that means some are going to succumb. Okay? But it also means who is on the scene during this time. What is, if you're warring against saints, there are saints. There are a lot of people that will tell you that there are no saved people during this time. So you have to look at the very obvious things that God tells you. Okay? So there are saints on the scene during the time. Okay, now the beast has 42 months or 3.5 years. The woman is fleeing in the wilderness. Some of this is getting scrunched up here, so you have to hang with it. But what is the event that ends that 3.5 years? Chapter 19 of Revelation. Who comes? Jesus, thank you. Jesus comes. The Son of Man comes, and the armies of the world have been gathered prior to this, but they come to a place, and where do they gather? What is it called? Armageddon, or Harmageddon, or Armageddon as we call it. So you've heard probably many times the Battle of Armageddon. Okay, so if you want to call that the Battle of Armageddon, that's okay. But that's because Jesus returns, and who is with him? His army is with him, according to Revelation chapter 19, right? We also find out through some of our studies in Matthew who is with him, besides his army, besides human army. Angels. Good. I'm glad you picked up on that. Okay, so you've got the Son of Man returning. As a result of the Son of Man returning and the Battle of Armageddon, we've already mentioned it, the beast and false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. You also have, at that point, the Great Supper of God. Do you remember that? The Great Supper of God, because the birds have been told to assemble for the Great Supper of God, and then after this battle, what do they do that is the Great Supper of God? They eat the flesh of the horses and the army that came against Jesus. How did the army that came against Jesus die?
The sword.
The sword that comes out of the mouth of Jesus kills them. Okay, these are things you found in the book of Revelation. And we can put them, you can put more information up here. I'm just putting some highlights. Okay, now after Jesus comes, when you head into chapter 20 of Revelation, the first thing you see is an angel comes down to earth with a chain, and what does he do? He binds Satan for 1,000 years. Okay, I didn't even put that up here. Satan bound. Okay, so during the 1,000-year reign, Satan is bound. What is the purpose of binding Satan? So that he can't do what?
Deceive.
You can't deceive any longer during that 1,000 years. But at the end of the 1,000 years, what happens?
He's released.
He's released for a short time. What does he do?
Deceive.
He deceives, and he gathers an army, and that army comes against what appears to be Jerusalem. It's talked about the holy city, the camp of the saints around the holy city. And what happens as a result? It's very quickly said. What happens? Who takes care of it?
Jesus.
God takes care of it by fire coming down from heaven, right? And destroying the army. And then what happens to Satan?
He's
He's cast into the lake of fire, right? That's the place that has been prepared for him from the beginning of the world and his angels. You find that in other parts of Scripture, by the way. Okay? But right after, one of the things that happens after he is bound for 1,000 years is thrones are set up. And there are people sitting on those thrones, and that's not after the 1,000 years, that's the beginning of the 1,000 years. So during this time frame, there's what going on? Judgment going on, right? Okay? At the end, you've got Satan cast into the lake of fire, and that sometimes is called the battle of Gog and Magog, because if you notice it says he gathered Gog and Magog. So you'll hear that statement being made, the battle of Gog and Magog. It's really not much of a battle. The army gathered, and God destroyed them. With fire, and threw Satan into the lake of fire. Then, what is the next event?
Great white throne.
The great white throne judgment. And there are a book open and books are open. Who are dead? Who are dead? Who are judged? I just told you. Who are judged? The dead and death and Hades are brought before the great white throne. And what is the result of their judgment? Every one of them what? Go into the lake of fire. This is also called the second death. So you've heard the phrase, maybe you've heard the phrase, born once, die twice. Born twice, die once. This is the idea. If you're physically born and that's the only birth you have, and you're not reborn spiritually, as what we call born again, what Jesus called born again. If you're born once, you're not just going to die physically, but you're going to go to the second death. If you're physically born and spiritually born twice, you only physically die. You don't face the second death, right? That's a very important concept, okay? So death and the dead and death go into the lake of fire also. Okay. Then after you have the new heaven, new earth, and new Jerusalem. Okay. Now, all of that was pretty much from the book of Revelation. We started adding in the last couple of weeks, we started adding in from Matthew chapter 23 going into 24, and then also from Daniel, we started looking, and from 2 Thessalonians. In 2 Thessalonians, because it's pretty brief, let's think about it, because you can look at it, but we can talk. I'd like you to think about it. I'd like you to remember it. It's on the left-hand side of my page in my Bible. But who is named in the book of 2 Thessalonians? There's a man. What is he called?
Prince who is to come.
No, that's in Daniel. There's
Okay.
a prince who is to come in Daniel. I like that you remember that, though. In 2 Thessalonians, there is a man of lawlessness, right? He's called the man of lawlessness. What does he do? He goes into the temple. What does he do? He seats himself in the temple and displays himself as God, right? Okay. And we believe that that is the abomination of desolation. It's not named that in the book of 2 Thessalonians, but we believe it's the same thing. So if you want to put here, MOL, the man of lawlessness. Okay, but what also does he do? He stops what? Sacrifices and grain offerings. So you've got sacrifices stopped. I've got that written here. That's from 2 Thessalonians. That's one place we see it. He stops the sacrifices and grain offerings. Okay, he does that. And that, we believe, is also the abomination of desolation, because that would be an abomination to go into the temple and display yourself as God. Now, what does that tell you has to be in place?
Temple.
There has to be a temple. Okay, so just like the beast has to be over here, so does a temple. So there's temple worship going on prior to this point. We don't know how long, but prior to this point, there is temple worship going on, back in play. And he puts a stop to sacrifices and grain offerings. Okay? There is something, 2 Thessalonians says, that is restraining him now, but that restraint will be removed. Okay? And we know his end comes, 2 Thessalonians tells us, when Jesus returns. Okay? So if his end comes when Jesus returns, who is he? According to the book of Revelation. Whose end comes when Jesus returns? The beast. Very good. So the man of lawlessness, who stops sacrifices and grain offerings at the middle of the week, is also the beast. He is the beast. He's lining up. Okay? Now in the book of Daniel, we looked at the prophecy, we looked at several of the prophecies, we looked at Daniel 9 quite a bit, then we looked at 11 through 12 as well. We didn't cover it very well last week. But in chapter 9, there's one who comes on the wing of abominations who has his end. Okay, so if that is also the abomination of desolation that Jesus talks about in Matthew, well, let's go back to Matthew 24 before we go to Daniel. Think in our minds. Y'all can go there or we can think. I'm trying to do this from memory. And it does help if I force myself to try to remember it. Matthew 24, Jesus is asked, okay, back up to 23. Jesus talks to them in the temple. He's talking to the ones he calls hypocrites. And then they walk out of the temple. Right before, at the end of 23, Jesus says, I leave this temple to you desolate. Okay? Then he walks out. He's got his disciples with him. And they go eventually to the Mount of Olives so that they're looking over at the temple. But as they walk along, they're looking at the temple buildings and the disciples are pointing them out. And when he talks to them, he says, not one stone is going to be left upon another. Right? Jesus says that. And so they ask him some questions. Do you remember the questions?
When will this happen?
When will these things happen? And what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now you could separate that into 3 questions, or the second question can be 1 question. I'm not going to fight you on that. But when you look at those, it looks like it's 2 questions. Okay. In Matthew 24, what does Jesus answer of those 2 questions?
See that no one misleads you.
He starts with see that no one misleads you, but he doesn't really ever completely answer or very well answer the first question. He's told them the temple's going to be destroyed, but he doesn't really answer the question of when will that happen. But he does answer he answers the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. Okay, so according to Matthew 24, the sign of his coming, or his coming, corresponds to what on our timeline? Jesus coming. Okay, the Son of Man returning. The end of the age is also corresponding to Jesus' return, according to what Matthew 24 is calling the end of the age. Okay, so Jesus answers that question, doesn't he? So he talks in a little bit about birth pangs, right? So birth pangs would be somewhere over here, according to Matthew 24. Signs of wars and rumors of wars and nation against nation and armies, and then people are going to try to act like they're the Christ, the false Christ, and mislead. There's a lot of things that we would call part of the birth pangs. But then he also says, but the gospel is going to be presented to the whole world before the end. But when he starts talking about events, he starts with what event? Like real
Tribulation.
the abomination of desolation, right? That's where we find, one of the places we find the term abomination of desolation is Matthew 24. And Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, let the reader beware. And then the next thing he says to those in Judea to do what?
Flee.
Flee to the mountains. What does that sound like from Revelation? Who's fleeing in Revelation?
Jews.
The woman, Israel, is fleeing to the wilderness, right? Okay, so that would sound like what Jesus is saying, let those in Judea flee to the mountains. He said, don't even turn back and get a coat. Just run. This is how bad it is, okay? And then he says, after the abomination of desolation, then we have the great tribulation. Or there is a great tribulation that happens. What ends the tribulation? Because he said, immediately following the tribulation of those days,
Christ comes.
Jesus comes. Exactly. And with him are his angels, and they're going to gather the elect from the 4 corners or 4 winds, something like that, of the earth. So the end of the Great Tribulation we can set. We can start it with the abomination of desolation, and it ends with the coming of Christ. Okay, so this 3.5 years is that Great Tribulation. Okay, that's how we put it into what we've already learned from Revelation and how God reveals from other places. Okay, so that ends with the coming of the Son of Man. Okay, now, that's from, then we have some illustrations, and we'll get into Matthew 25 in a minute, but we want to fill in a little bit of Daniel. We saw the fourth kingdom mentioned in Daniel in chapter, we looked at it last week, Daniel 4 or 5, I think. And the fourth kingdom is the kingdom of Rome. It's not named Rome in Daniel, but we know it's the dreadful beast of Rome that we know is Rome. It's the toes and the feet of the statue of Daniel chapter 2. But when you looked at Daniel chapter 9, and we see those 70 weeks, we've already talked about some of them. This is the 62 plus 7 part that ends with Messiah the Prince, ends with him being cut off, and it ends with afterwards the city is destroyed. So that's all in this period of time here of the first part of AD, I guess you could say. Around 33 AD is crucifixion, right before that, and then 70 AD is the city being destroyed. And that's even mentioned in Daniel 9. Okay. And then it transitions in Daniel 9 to the prince who is to come and what he's going to do, and the wing of abominations and all that happens, that talks about in Daniel 9. There's a lot in Daniel 9. But in Daniel 9:27 it says, he will make a firm covenant for 1 week. That's this covenant that lasts this 70th week. Starts here. He'll make a firm covenant for 1 week. That's that 70th week. So there is obviously a gap of time between here and here. There's 69 weeks fulfilled in succession, and then there's a gap of time. We don't know how long that's going to be. It hasn't happened, hasn't been fulfilled yet. Sorry? Okay.
Right around his calf area.
Right. His calves. The calves of the statue. Very good. Then we looked at chapter 11 of Daniel, and we believe that through verse 35, 11, 1 through 35, we believe has been fulfilled in the past, because we can put dates and time to it. But Daniel 11:36 through 12, all the way through chapter 12, 13, we don't believe that part's been fulfilled yet, because nothing has been exactly fulfilled. And understand, when God gives a prophecy, he fulfills it exactly the way he says. So if you have a prophecy that looks like it's being fulfilled, but not exactly, then it might be giving you an idea of what's coming down the line, but it's not the exact fulfillment, because it's going to be exact. Okay, but in chapter 11, verse 31, he talks about forces from him will arise and desecrate the sanctuary fortress and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. Okay, that happened in 165 BC. And that was with
Antiochus
Antiochus Epiphanes. 165 BC, obviously prior to Christ. Okay. Just hang on for a second, because it's kind of important that you understand that event happened. We can set it in time and history, and I'm going to ask you an obvious question. If it happened in 165 BC and Christ was crucified in around 33 AD, when did that happen in relationship to Jesus' earthly ministry? It's very obvious. Before.
Yeah.
Okay. So, during Jesus' earthly ministry in Matthew 24, when he's speaking and he references an abomination of desolation that they're to look for happening, that hasn't happened yet, is he talking about this one?
No.
No. He's talking about a future one. Very good. So there was an abomination of desolation, and he says that from Daniel the prophet. Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place that Daniel the prophet talked about, and it's said better than that, I'm not exactly quoting, he's not talking about this one, although Daniel did talk about that one. He's talking about a future one. It's really important to kind of separate those two out. So when you look at Daniel chapter 11, verse, 31, that has been fulfilled. In Jesus' time and in our time, that one has been fulfilled. And what it does, when God does that, is He gives us a picture of what's another one's going to happen, and He gives us a picture of what it's going to be like. So when that one happened in history and time, you had Antiochus Epiphanes, who despised the Jews. There's a whole slew of things I could tell you historically, if I could remember them all. He was going back and forth, and anyway, he hated the Jews, and he went in and he sacrificed a pig on the altar, and he set up a statue of Zeus in the temple. That would be an abomination. And the Jews now have a festival of lights, or they call it Hanukkah, that occurs in around December, because that's when they went in and cleansed the temple because of that abomination. That's in what we call the intertestament period, between the end of the writing of the Old Testament and the beginning of Matthew of the New Testament. It happened during that time period, because the last book of Malachi had already been written. So it's in that what we call or between the Testament period. And there are some books that are written, history books that are written, where you can read about the Festival of Lights and the cleansing of the temple and the fight to try to regain the Maccabean revolt as it's called, to regain Jerusalem for a short period of time. But it gives us an idea. That abomination of desolation is what chapter 11 of Daniel 31 is talking about. Then when you move forward, Daniel chapter 12 also talks about abomination of desolation that hasn't happened yet. That would be the one Jesus was referring to that's going in Matthew 24. And that's the one Jesus says that Daniel mentioned. In Matthew 24, Jesus is talking. So this one happened, Jesus' earthly ministry is here. He mentions in Matthew 24 this one, but he's referring to Daniel's 12. Not Daniel 11. He doesn't say that. But that's how you have to parse it and figure it out. But in Daniel 11, the rest of it, he talks about this person as king. Okay? So that's the reason I have king here, wars with the saints. Because you see that mentioned in Daniel 11. The king that wars with the saints. We've already seen someone warring with saints during that period of time. Who was that?
The beast.
The beast. So who's the king of Daniel 11? The beast. Okay? The man of lawlessness of of 2 Thessalonians, the beast of Revelation. Now we see him as the king of Daniel 11:36 and on. Okay? And what kingdom is he going to come out of? The Roman kingdom. Okay? A revived Roman kingdom. Okay. Now in Daniel chapter 12, it talks about a time of distress is mentioned, such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who's found in the book, will be rescued. That's Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. This time of distress, such as never occurred, sounds like what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24. What did he call it? He said a time of great tribulation, such as never occurred. And if God had not shortened the days, no one would survive. That is that last 3.5 years. So you can also call this a time of distress. It's going to be really, really bad. So something that occurred to me during my studies of Revelation before is we have a tendency to start thinking about the gathering. Like we saw in Ezekiel, remember we studied Ezekiel, the gathering of God's people back to the land? We have a tendency to think of that as once they start going back to the land, it's all going to be okay. Has it been okay? No. It's not been okay for the Jews in Israel yet.
Ever, since they went back. I mean, they
Right.
had peace.
Not since, it was in 1948 when they were declared a nation, till now. I mean, that's a long time. It's not been a time of peace.
And it's really bad now.
Yes.
You know,
It's really bad. Although interestingly, it's safer to go to Jerusalem, even with all that you hear on the news, than it is to go to New York City.
I just had a woman that I graduated with, she's on Facebook, and she just got back from there right before all this stabbing started, but she said she never felt unsafe. I wondered if she.
It's hard sitting here to think about it being a safe place.
Right.
And as I say that about New York, that may not be true now, and it may not be true, but that was true not long ago.
Mhm.
That it was, if you look at the per capita rate, murder rate and all, New York is worse than
I
Jerusalem.
believe that's right.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm sorry, but Chicago probably, yeah, Chicago probably is up there higher.
Yeah.
There's just more people, I guess, in New York than even Chicago. But yes, so put it in perspective, but there's going to be coming a time that even though God has a plan, and thank God we can see it, we can write it up on our board, He's got something He's going to do, and it's all going to culminate exactly the way it's supposed to. And these phrases are wonderful. Everyone whose name is found written in the book will be rescued. Awesome. I'm so glad. But there's going to be a lot of bad in there. So if we start telling people, telling Jews, for instance, if you're talking to Jews, that you're going to go back to the land and it's all going to be great, we're setting them up. That is not the truth. It's going to be really, really bad. And at one point they have to run. They have to leave Jerusalem and go to a place God's prepared for them. And hope it's not in winter. Hope you're not pregnant nursing and all that. Okay, so Daniel's told about the end time in chapter 12, and then at chapter 12, verse 11, he says, from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished, remember, 2 Thessalonians tells us he will stop the sacrificing grain offerings, he being the man of lawlessness. And now in Daniel it says, from the time that the regular sacrifice is stopped, here we are again, then there's going to be, how long, sorry?
1,335.
Yeah, first it's 1290 and then it's 1335. So that's the reason I've got plus 30 and plus 45 here. That's beyond the 1260 that end with Christ's return. The 1290 would go into what time frame?
The 3.5 years.
No, it would go beyond that. It goes into a
1,000
1,000-year reign.
1,000 years.
Okay, so it goes, that's the reason I have it beyond here.
1260, yeah.
That would be 1290, and then you add another 45 to get to the 1335. What did we say is going to start here? Once Satan is bound in chapter 20 of Revelation, thrones are set up.
Judgment.
Judgment's going to happen. Okay, now let's go to Matthew 24 and 25 that we looked at this week. We'd already looked at 24. But after Jesus kind of starts giving, not kind of, he says abomination of desolation, then he talks about great tribulation, and then he talks about immediately following the tribulation of those days is the sign of the Son of Man coming and the Son of Man coming and the elect. All of that's being said up to through chapter 24 verse 31. Then from 32 through the end, which is 51, he starts giving us what?
Parables.
Parables or illustrations, right. He starts telling us other things, and he's illustrating something. He's pointing back to some of the things he's talked about, right? So he talks about in the days of Noah, right? What was going on in the days of Noah?
People were living their lives.
People were living normally, living their lives. Not great, because they were all unrighteous, but marrying, giving in marriage, drinking, having dinner, whatever. Just living life. And all the way up to what happened? The flood came. Okay, so they were unaware, except we know they weren't uninformed, right? What was going on when Noah was building the boat? From the account of Noah, from other parts of Scripture, what do we know Noah was doing?
He was telling them.
He was preaching. Yes, he was preaching. And the word preaching is the word evangelize. That's how we would use the word. If you look it up, it's evangelizo. It's sharing what in particular? If you're evangelizing the gospel, right. So Noah would have been sharing the gospel. What's the goal of the gospel? Salvation, right? So Noah would be telling them the way to get saved, right? People that have studied the ark and studied how it was constructed and very strictly according to Scripture will tell you that if you took the correct number of animals of every kind, not every possible form. Like you would take a gray cat and a yellow cat and whatever, you would take cats, and then from those cats, you would get, that would be your kind, you would get the variety that we have today. But if you took a kind of every animal, a representation, and the correct number, because sometimes it was 2 and sometimes it was more depending on clean and unclean, and put them in that ark in their compartments, along with the 8 people, there was plenty of space left over. Not those cute little pictures that we have in children's books where the giraffes are sticking their heads out because there's no room, right? Or the rhinoceros are sticking their heads out because there's no room. There would have been plenty of room for a lot of people. So even in the provision of the ark, God's plan, God's size, God's everything that Noah participated in building, it saved them through the ark, through the flood. Saved them how many? Thems. How many people?
Nobody went on.
Noah's family.
His family.
How many? There were 8. There were 8 on the boat, 8 on the ark. That then repopulated from them. They repopulated the world. Millions and millions and millions of people. But if you think about that, they were living their lives. Noah and his family, directed by God, got on the ark. Who closed the door?
He did.
God closed the door. And the flood came. And it was pretty instantaneous because water came up and water came down. And there would have been this cataclysmic event that happened, but it still would have taken time. They weren't just sitting on there in a few drops. Sometimes it's depicted that way. You know, a few little drops, and it takes some time, and then eventually it floats out. No, I mean, water was coming up. Water was coming from everywhere. But it still would have taken time. But people absolutely got it. When? When the water came and they were dying. But as that was happening, God had provided the message and God had provided the means. Is that not true today?
Yes. He does.
And we're supposed to be the Noahs as we're building whatever our ark is, not necessarily building an ark, but as we're participating in doing whatever God wants us to. So if you look at these other illustrations, what is God saying of the people that he's illustrating here? He's got the sensible, faithful slave and the evil slave. What are they to be found doing? The master's not around, the master comes back.
There's supposed to be
Some
on the
doubled
alert.
their money and one hid it in the ground.
Okay, so you've got the parable of the talents that we found, I think, in Matthew 13. But yeah, some of them did, no, I'm sorry, that was in Matthew 25. I've got to get my parables right. Yes, he gave them different amounts. In that parable, he gave them different monetary amounts. And what did the 3 different ones do with it? The one that had 5 did what? Doubled it and had 10. And what did the master say to him?
Well done.
Well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter into what?
My rest.
Okay, enter into the joy of your master. And he says, I will put you in charge of things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one that had 2 also doubled it. So he did with what he was given, right? He didn't match the 10, but he did the same percentage as the 5, right? 100% markup, if you want to call it that. And he was said, what was said to him?
Same thing.
Well done, exactly. Enter into the joy of your master. And then the one that had 1,
And he buried it.
he buried it,
Because he knew
feared
that his master was not.
Right. He feared the master and viewed him as harsh and all of this. And so what was said to him? Well done?
Well, no.
No.
He lost his talent and then he was sent to a bad place.
What is said of him? What is said of that place?
He will suffer.
Weeping and gnashing of teeth. When you gnash your teeth, you're in pain. Like you grind your teeth because you're in pain. weeping and gnashing of teeth. And the outer darkness it's also called. But he was called a wicked and lazy slave. And what he had was taken and given to the one who had the most, or had been given the most in the first place. And they're also told, the 5 and the 2 are told, they're going to be put in charge of some things. That's part of their reward, is they're going to be put in charge of things. And they're told, well done. Then you've got the 10 virgins. 5 were called what?
Foolish.
5 were foolish, and 5 were
Prudent.
prudent. And the prudent ones did what? What made them prudent, I guess?
They were prepared.
They were prepared. The other 5 were foolish and weren't prepared, right? And in the preparation, in the illustration, is they had oil and they had their wicks trimmed, right? They were ready, okay? And then suddenly, it says at midnight, in other words, the middle of the night, what happens?
Announcement that the
Bridegroom.
bridegroom is coming.
Right. They're awakened with the wonderful news that the bridegroom has come. They all get up. They all rush out, because this is what they've been waiting on. They all rush out. But 5 of them, the 5 foolish, look at the 5 prudent and say what?
Give me some of your oil.
Yeah, I'm not ready. You are. I want some. And the 5 prudent say, we can't give you what we have because then we won't have enough. They're not being selfish. They're not being selfish at all. And so the 5 foolish are told to go off and buy more. In the middle of the night, they're going to have to find somebody that'll sell them something, according to the story. And the 5 prudent meet the bridegroom and they get to go in, right? And the door is closed. And the foolish come up, bang at the door, we want in, we want in. And what does the bridegroom say to them?
Do not know you.
I don't know you. This is a very sobering
It's a
illustration.
very good picture.
It's a very good picture. It really is. And we'll see more, but they're like, open up. And he says, truly I say to you, I don't know you. This is one of the places where you'll hear me say, it's not who you know, it's who you're known by. Who knows you that's important? And who is the one that needs to know you to be important in this illustration? I'm asking, actually that's not rhetorical. Who do you need to be known by? Jesus, exactly, God, right. And when Jesus says at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, many will come to me and say, Lord, Lord. And others are calling him Lord. They're giving him the title. They're calling out to him. You'll have people all the time that'll say, I cried out to God. And you hope that it's good. But when he's going to say, many are going to come to me and say, Lord, Lord. And I'm going to look at them and say,
Never knew you.
I never knew you. He says more, but he says, depart from me, you workers of iniquity, I never knew you. Very similar to this. And that's one of the places where I will say what I just said. It's not who you know, it's who you're known by. Jesus, and it does matter who you know. Okay, he repeats this phrase, be on alert, for you don't know the day your Lord is coming. Be on alert, you don't know the day or the hour. Okay, so these are illustrations. If you back up, you've got in chapter 24, you have the faithful and sensible slave versus the evil slave saying, he's not going to come for a while, and he beats his fellow slaves. And he says, be careful. He says, you shall be cut him in pieces, it says, and assign him to the place of hypocrites where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So there's this phrase again, weeping and gnashing of teeth. And that's where in chapter 25, you also see the one that's called the wicked and lazy slave is going to be sent. Okay. Now, the rest of the chapter, starting in verse 31, is an extremely familiar passage. You've probably heard many a sermon about this, and I hope they were great. I hope you learned something from it. There's a lot we can learn from this. But when Jesus is talking about this, remember, if you go back, because you've got to put it in context, go back to the beginning of chapter 4, 2 questions were asked of him. We're still in the same time frame. We're still in the same discussion. 24 doesn't go to 25, and we're somewhere else. So in 24, he's asked the question, when will these things be? Meaning the temple, or even the other stuff he talked about with them at the end of 23, but certainly we talked about the temple. And then it says, what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? He then in 24 talks about the abomination of desolation, the great tribulation, and the coming of the Son of God, Son of Man. And then in chapter 25, starting in verse 30, what did I say, 1? It says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory. So we've had these illustrations, and now we're back to time things, events. Do you see that? Those illustrations weren't just kind of a, let's take a little bit of a commercial break, but it was illustrating that need to be on alert, to be careful. He'd already given them warnings in 24 to not be misled. Don't be, there's a lot of warnings, but he's saying be on alert because you don't know when. Be on alert, you don't know when. As he illustrated with Noah, they knew it was going to happen with this level of certainty that we have too. These events that we're talking about are going to happen, just like what Noah was telling the people of his day was going to happen. They didn't believe it, but they had the information. Same thing going on today. And you have to ask yourself, you're writing all this stuff down, you're studying it, but do you really believe it? Do you believe it enough not only to be prepared yourself, but to tell others like Noah did? But understand how effective was Noah from the world's success kind of standards. Not very. When millions died and 8 survived. But who did he get to get on the boat? His family. His wife, his 3 sons, and their wives did get on the boat. If you contrast that to Lot, he couldn't even get his 2 daughters, I don't think they were married yet, but like fiancés, he couldn't get them to come with him. And his wife turned around. So Lot wasn't as successful as even Noah was. But this is not success in the world's way of looking at success, but it's success in the way of God's way of looking at things. Remember, narrow gate, narrow road, wide road, narrow gate, wide gate. But just like in those days that are coming, that are still future to us, and in where we stand right now, we have this information. We're getting it at least. We're gathering it. We need to be telling people. We need to be, because this is as certain as that flood in Noah's day, and as effective as the flood was in Noah's day. Okay, so chapter 25, verse 31. When the Son of Man comes. When is he coming?
Nobody knows.
Oh, after the tribulation.
After the tribulation. We don't know the day or the hour. He keeps telling us that, but it's going to happen. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels are with him. How many of the angels are with him? All the angels are with him. This is great. I mean, I've been glad for them. Then he will sit on his glorious throne. When is that? In the 1,000-year reign. He's going to come and he's going to reign during this time, right? He's going to sit on his glorious throne. And verse 32, I want you to look at the 4th word and tell me what it says.
Verse 32.
Verse 32.
Oh,
And all the
nations.
Now remember, Kay made a big point in her video last week. We've looked at this in our lesson for 2 weeks. Who is Jesus talking to throughout 23, 24, and 25? Where is he? Jerusalem. Who's he talking to? He's talking, here it says nations, but he's talking to specifically his disciples, but he's talking in the general sense to the Jews. When you looked at the abomination of desolation, it says those in Judea flee to the mountains. And it says, hopefully it won't be on the Sabbath. Who's impacted by that? The Jews. Over and over again, we've pointed out the focal group that Jesus is talking to are the Jews. Okay? But here he says, all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another. So is he talking about Jews when he's talking about the nations? Unless they're included in the nations, usually it's Jews and everybody else. That's the way God looks at things. It's Jews and Gentiles. Jews and the Greeks, which is a representation of the world. Or Jews and whatever. It's Jews and Gentiles. It's nations usually is anybody else besides Israel. Okay, so when he's talking about the nations. Who's he talking to? Still, he's talking to the Jewish people. Okay? It needs to be heard by us, don't get me wrong. But That's his audience. And all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from the other, and as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, right? He will put the sheep on his right, he'll put the goats on his left. What now? We're going to look at sheep and goats, right? Okay, no, first, when does this happen? When the Son of Man comes and he sits on his throne. When are we talking about on our timeline? The 1,000-year reign. Okay, so the sheep and goats are in this time period, not under the lake of fire. That just happens to be there. But in this time frame, from the 1,000-year reign, here you've got the sheep and the goats separated. He's going to come, and he's going to come in all his glory, and his angels are going to be with him, and the nations are going to be gathered in front of him. Remember in chapter 20 of Revelation, thrones are going to be set up for judgment. Okay? So, he's going to separate the sheep from the goats. The criteria is what? What is he, and I say criteria, he's going to say, you did this, you did this, you did this, or you didn't do this, you didn't do this, and you didn't do this. What, did you write them down? He says, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was a stranger, you invited me in. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick, you visited me. When I was in prison, you came. Now the sheep that are on the right are also called what? There's some other words. How are they described? The sheep. How are they described? What is said of them? Look at your text.
It's the difference between believers and non-believers.
Okay. So you're saying the sheep are what?
Believers.
Okay. What is the word used, though? Let's look at it.
They're blessed by the Father.
They're blessed.
Inherit the kingdom.
Okay, they're blessed. They inherit the kingdom. Okay. And I'm not disagreeing with you, John. I just wanted to look at the actual words. It says, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world, blessed of my Father. And then he talks about that criteria, but he also calls them, when they respond in verse 37, it says, then the righteous. So they're also the righteous. And that's where I would say, yes, they're believers, right? Mm-hmm. They're inheriting the kingdom. They're definitely believers, okay? And I put plus R for righteousness. Now, the goats are described how? Accursed, right? They're called accursed. Are they told they're going to inherit the kingdom? No. And he says to the ones on the left, depart from me. Now the ones on the right, it's come. The ones, here they're told to come. These are told to depart. And that sounds like the foolish virgins, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. And he says, accursed ones, where is their final destination? Into eternal fire. And what does it say about that eternal fire? Prepared for the devil and his angels. Okay? And then it says, the same criteria. I was hungry and you did not. I was thirsty, you did not. Stranger, all of that. And they come back with, when did we see you hungry? And he says, this is part of the criteria. With the righteous and with the accursed, he says, when you did it or didn't do it to Jesus. No, I'm sorry. When you didn't do it to who?
Did not do it to the one of the least of these.
Right. First, in the righteous part, he says, in verse 40, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. So the criteria, and I'm calling it criteria, is if you did it to his brothers, even the least, you did it to Jesus. It goes back to, it always reminds me of Saul, on his way, and he's knocked off the horse, and Jesus says, why are you persecuting me? Because when Saul answers, he's like, who are you? He says, when you go after my people, you're going after me. Understand, that's how Jesus views you. You are that precious to him that if someone does something to you and you're his, they're doing it to Jesus. That's how personally Jesus takes it. That's covenant. That's covenant. And we can understand that on a human level. Yeah. You do it to my kids, oh my. Oh my. I'll take a lot. And I had an incident recently, it was minor, not huge, but I realized I got more upset by a behavior that was happening to me over and over and over again when it happened to somebody I cared about. Not even family, just a friend. And that was kind of like, I'm done. You know, I'm just done, because don't do that to somebody I care about. I'll take it. Do it to me. I mean, I don't like it. But when you do it to somebody I care about, because I'm a defender, that's just me. But as a mom, we all get that one. We all understand that one. So Jesus says, to the extent that you did it to my brothers. Now I've made a point, this is talking about the nations. The sheep and the goats come out of nations. But Jesus is now talking about brothers. Who would his brothers be? The Jews. There's a distinction being made here. The brothers are his Jews. He's talking to the Jews. He said, I came to the nation of Israel. Not that the message wasn't going to go further, but Jesus is in his earthly ministry. You've got to remember that. Also, Kay pointed out last week, Matthew's goal in writing, each one of the Gospels were written from kind of a perspective. God used specific people to write his words using their emphasis, I'll put it that way. Matthew's Gospel is written to prove, in essence, to prove Jesus is king. King of the Jews. That's Matthew's goal in writing his Gospel. So when you read, a lot of times, we're going to see next week, Luke writing about this same event. And Luke tells us things that Matthew doesn't show us. Not that they're contradictory. It's like you've got to bring it all together to get the whole story. It'd be like all of us witnessing the same event, and Deb would notice things that I didn't notice, mainly because I'm here and I can't see the front door. Seriously, she can see the front door. Or Carolyn, or any of you. Donna can't. Donna can see up here, but Sandy can see all the way up to the back of Donna's head. Part that Donna can't see. You know, we all have different perspectives, and we see things differently, but we also sometimes, when you're talking to somebody, you focus on the things that you need that person to understand. You kind of leave off some of the other, you know, because at that moment in that message, this is what's important, not all of this. I have a problem with that, because I think everything needs to be said. But Luke, when he's writing, as you go to look at Luke, Luke's goal, he's a physician, he's methodical,
Chronological.
he wants to show you the chronology. He wants to show you how events happen. So if you want to look in Matthew and Mark, or even John, as to when an event happens, you go to Luke and you see when it happens in relation one to the other, if it's not in the text and tells you. But so Matthew didn't answer the first question of when's the temple going to be torn down. He's more interested in when's the king returning. So he tells you about that. Luke is going to tell you more. Mark's going to tell you some other things when we look at that. But Jesus is talking about his brothers, and that criteria is tied to how people treat his brothers as opposed to the nations. The nations are what's being separated here. When are they being separated? Don't forget, in the 1,000-year reign. Okay? Maybe that's what's taken this 30 extra days and this 45 days beyond the 1,260. Maybe that's what's going on during that time, is this sheep and goats judgment. Okay? But the ultimate end of all of this is the eternal fire, the accursed and the depart. They're going to their eternal punishment, right? Where the sheep are going to what? The last verse. Eternal life. Okay, now, if you look up on our board, what would be this eternal fire or eternal punishment?
Would be
The lake of fire, the second death, right? So this is the same thing as that. So is this, right? Who goes there? At the end of the 1,000-year reign, everyone that faces the great white throne judgment, right? And one of the things that was told to us about the great white throne judgment that was the basis for which you were sent to the lake of fire or into the second death is your name was not found where? Not found in the book of life. So that would be the goats would not be found in the book of life. Going back to what Donna said, unbelievers. That's a simple way of looking at this. Believers and unbelievers out of the nations. Okay, again, here's another obvious question. At this point, with the sheep and goat judgment that's happening at the beginning of the 1,000-year reign, that starts with Christ's return, and lots of other things we're going to see are going on. But Christ's return, you got the Battle of Armageddon, you've got the beast of the false prophet thrown into the lake of fire, you've got people that die in that army, but you've got people. At the end of this great tribulation, you have people that are alive. People that are being judged. You've got people that are saved. As we would call saved. They're believers. They're righteous. They're entering into His kingdom that they're going to inherit. Who's reigning with Christ during this time? The saints. So we can also call the sheep saints. Tying things together. Putting things, that's why it's so important in Revelation to set that timeline. To set those things that we can, and then when we look at other parts of Scripture, try to get them, we're not trying to shoehorn things. We're just trying to see, do they fit? And they've got to fit exactly, or don't even bother. And then we looked in Matthew 13, I don't know how much time we have, we're probably way over our time, at the wheat and the tares. Now this is among a bunch of parables that sometimes are called the kingdom parables. Because what is a phrase Jesus says a lot? The kingdom of heaven may be compared to, and then he tells a parable, right? Okay, so the wheat and the tares, after the soils, you've got the parable of the soils, and then you've got the parable, you've got the explanation of the parable of the soils, and you've got the, I like to say dirt, because I don't say soils very well, but the parable of dirt. Now you've got the parable of the wheat and the tares, and there's different parts to this. Simple parable, you've got a master, he's sowing good seed. His slaves go out to work in the fields, and what do they find? Among the good wheat coming up, what do they find? Tares. So those tares, I don't know what a tare is, but apparently it's not wheat, it's not wanted. Let's call it a weed. Right? Okay. But it also must, for a time, look like similar to wheat. You've all done a little bit of gardening, right? And if you've ever taken a patch, like maybe with your kids, and prepared the soil and you sprinkled some seed in it from a packet of wildflowers or something, and then these little things start sprouting up, and it's so exciting. But at some point you're trying to weed it out, and you're going, what is weed and what is good? Because a lot of the weeds look good for a time. What determines, what helps us know the difference? Like with flowers, what helps us know? How do you identify flowers? By the flower, right? By the bloom, by the produce, right? So with wheat, how do you determine the difference between wheat and tares? Especially me, how would I determine the difference? Because I'm not that versed in it.
The leaves.
When it grows up,
It's
and it has wheat on it, right? How would I identify a fruit tree as to what kind of fruit?
on it.
Once it has the fruit, then I know what kind of tree it is. You might be able to be good enough to identify it by its shape and bark. I'm not that good. You might be able to define it in spring by the color of the leaves or the blossoms.
Yeah.
I'm not that good. When the fruit gets on it, we're absolutely sure, right? Or what if you have a blooming pear tree, but not a producing pear tree? How do you know the difference? When and if there's fruit, right? Okay, so in this parable, that's when the absolute known, the wheat grows up, okay? But the tares come, the slaves recognize it, and they're like, how did this happen? What's the explanation? How did the tares get there?
Someone else must have
Right?
planted it.
The enemy came in the night and planted the tares. This is not just, it just happened. The enemy came in and sowed the tares among the wheat. On purpose, did this, right? Okay, so after, what did the slaves say? Do you want us to go and get the tares out? What are they told?
No.
Not to, why?
Let
Because
the
when they
good
grow.
part grow so that you can reap it.
Yes, later you're gonna reap the wheat, but in the meantime, they could have gone and taken out the tares, and they're told not to because there's a concern. What is the concern? When you pull up the tare, what might you do?
You might pull the weed out.
You might uproot the good. Just wait till harvest. That's what they're told. Wait till the harvest. So,
That was such a good answer.
yeah, it was a good, yeah, I wonder who wrote that. Right, so they're told not to, and they're told why. So at the point of harvest, what happens? What are they told to do?
Pull the tears up first.
Pull the tares up. What are they told to do with them?
Gather them together and
Bind
tie
them
tie
and
up and throw them in
throw them in the fire.
Burn 'em.
Okay, so remember that. Tares are pulled first at the harvest. They're bound and they're thrown into the fire. Then what happens to the wheat?
It goes in
It's
the-
harvested
it
and
goes to the barn.
put in the barn. Right? Simple, right? They come to him afterwards because Jesus goes on to other parables and they say, explain that one to us. Because he's already told them why. They've asked the question, why do you tell parables? And it's so, they're like, he says, I'm going to paraphrase. Jesus is basically saying, I'm giving them illustrations that they can understand in their way of thinking, an agricultural basis, for instance, or life basis. You know, you have treasure, you find it, you know, hide it, whatever, you treasure it. And so he says, that's the reason I'm talking to them in parables, but guess what? They're not going to hear it. I'm going to say it so simply. I'm going to say it in a way that even a child can understand it. But they're going to have ears and not hear. They're going to have eyes and not see. Okay? And probably because of the hardness of their heart. But he explains it to them. Okay, now here we have the parts. Who's the master in the parable?
Son of man.
The Son of Man. What is the seed? The good seed?
The sons of the kingdom,
Sons of the kingdom. What are the tares?
sons of the devil.
Sons of the devil. Who's the enemy? The devil. Who are the harvesters?
Those are slaves.
No, the harvesters. Who are going and gathering the wheat? Who are doing the work?
Angels.
Angels. Okay. The angels are the harvesters, right? And he says the harvest is the end of the age. What's the end of the age? When Jesus returns. We can tie it to our timeline. So the Matthew 13 wheat and tares, the harvest is at the end of the age when Christ returns. Okay? So this is a time when you've got seeds, which are the sons of the, what does it say? I'm going to make sure I get sons of the kingdom. And you've got the sons of the evil one. They're growing up together in the same field. The field is what? It says the world. The field is the world. They're growing up together. And so at the end of the age, that's the harvest. At the end of the age, the tares are gathered first and thrown into the fire, while the wheat is taken into the barn. The barn represents, in our timeline up here, entering into the kingdom. Right? So if we look at our sheep and our goats, who are the sheep?
Wheat, it's the wheat.
And the tares would be the goats. Okay. Where do the goats go? They're gathered and sent into the lake of fire. Okay. If you go back to your Matthew 24 passage, where it talks about one is in the field, one is taken, two are in the field, one is taken and one is left. Two are at the grinding stone, I think. One is taken and one is left. Remember last week? The taken one is not the good one. The left one is the good one, because the left one enters into the kingdom. The taken one is sent to the fire. Okay? Each case. So I had told you, and I wrote it in my margin, the righteous are the saved, are the ones that are left. The unrighteous are the taken. Okay? So how many times have you heard the sheep and goats talked about? How many times have you heard the wheat and tares talked about possibly? And when it's talking about the wheat and tares, they talk about the rapture. Is it talking about the rapture? Or is it talking about when the Son of Man comes at the end of the age? That's what this tells you. Sometimes it's a little phrase that you have to grab onto. The harvest is the end of the age. The end of the age is when Christ returns to earth and sets up his earthly kingdom. So the taken ones are not the good ones.
Tears.
Right. They're the goats, the tares, the unrighteous. It's the left ones, the ones that are left, that enter into the kingdom. And sometimes you might need to tie these things together with cross-referencing in your margins, or I just write notes because I don't always remember when I go back to it. So I write myself notes in the margin to remember. And it says in verse 41, the Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all the stumbling blocks, those who commit lawlessness, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. In that place there shall be, there's that phrase again, weeping and gnashing of teeth. So if you go back to the illustrations of Matthew 24 and 25 more than once, it talks about those who go to the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. And if those are the same, if the weeping, because we put that up here too, weeping and gnashing of teeth, what would you now call this place that's weeping and gnashing of teeth, or the outer darkness? Lake of fire. Again, tying some of these things together. So now that when you go through these parables, these kingdom parables, and you see weeping and gnashing of teeth, I want you to think lake of fire. I want you to think outer darkness is lake of fire. I want you to think about when you get the parable of the wedding feast. There are those that are cast into the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. What are you going to think? Lake of fire. Every time. It is a very final type of place and destination and judgment.
No way out.
No way out.
Once you're in.
No. Once you're in, there's no way out. And after death, there is no change. You are waiting to go there. You know, your destination has been set. So when is the time of change? When someone's alive. And you and I don't know who they are. We can't say, that one's worth saving. This one's not worth saving. I want them to be with me in eternity. I don't want those to be with me in eternity. But we just scatter the seed of the soils. If you go to that parable, the seed is the gospel. The seed is good. We just go and spread it. It's not even our place to prepare the soils. If you notice that, the sower doesn't go and prepare. He just scatters. He just scatters. And the power's in the Gospels, what Romans 1 tells us. It's not in me. It's in the Gospel. The message. If we stay true to the message. That's all we got to do. Got to stay true to the message. And we get to participate in delivering it. That's what we get to do. We don't save anybody, but we get to participate. So, once again, I hope it's less confusing instead of more confusing, that we put some things up on our timeline, nailed some things down, illustrated even more clearly some of the things that are going to happen. Because Revelation doesn't tell us everything. Revelation tells us about 1,000-year reign, but it doesn't really tell us a lot of what's going to go on in there. That's what we're going to find as we continue to look. And next week, the question is, at the beginning of the lesson, lesson 7, things that must soon take place. And we're going to look in Luke 21, which is cross-referencing to Matthew 24 and 25. So be prepared for that. We're going to pray. Heavenly Father, we praise and thank you. Praise and thank you for the things that you have preserved for us to know, the things that are important, the things that we can put up on our timeline and